So on this week's episode of Growing Some Louisiana History, I'm going to talk about my favorite vegetable to grow of all time. If you've been following me for a while, you probably know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't figured it out, there's a clue behind me. And on my shirt. Curious? Well, stay tuned and find out. So welcome back to another episode of Growing Some Louisiana History with me, David Hubbell. Appreciate everybody who's already taken the time to subscribe to the David J. Hubbell YouTube channel, as well as click that bell to be alerted to all upcoming episodes that I'll be putting out on my Louisiana garden here in Mobile, and the various heirloom seeds and their stories and their histories that I'll be sharing with you. If you haven't done so, please take the time and go ahead and subscribe now, as well as click that bell. I appreciate it. So if you're a longtime follower of my YouTube channel, you probably realize one of the subjects that I talk a lot about is Mirliton. And that's what my favorite vegetable to grow is. That's right, the Louisiana heirloom Mirliton. But in particular, what I will be talking about is the variety I grow. We've called it the Boudreaux-Robert variety, and I'll tell you about the history of that in a bit. For those of you who also may not know, I'm part of the Mirliton.org, Mirliton.org nonprofit based out of New Orleans and founded by Dr. Lance Hill back in about 2009. We've been trying to preserve the heirloom Mirlitons that have been a staple on Louisiana and New Orleans tables for nearly 2 centuries. So I'm going to touch a little bit on that right now, and then also I'm going to dive in a little bit more into my particular variety. Oh, and if you're looking at the shirt I'm wearing, this is not a Boudreaux-Robert version, but this is the rare white Israel Thibodeau, and I'll probably do an episode on that as well in the future. But I'm not growing it in my yard, so I figured for right now I'll focus on what I've got in my backyard. So if you're not from the New Orleans area or even the Gulf Coast, you may not be familiar with the term Mirliton. You might have heard of it though as something called a chayote squash, or even vegetable pear, or choco or Christophine, depending upon which part of the world you're from. But the Mirlitons are found throughout the world. They grow them in Latin America, in Asian countries, and of course along the Gulf Coast. But I've read that they can grow in Germany and other parts of the world. Some people are growing them along the California coast and up as far as the North Coast. But really they're more ideally suited for zones 8B to 11. So they're really best suited for climates like our semi-tropical climates that you find along the Gulf Coast. They are perennials, they are a vining plant, and they are part of the cucuperate family. I can't remember if I can get the Latin name right. Sesum eljule, I believe is how it's pronounced. But anyway, they're pear-shaped, as you can kind of see there, a pear-shaped vegetable, and they have a single seed, and they grow on vines that can reach 50 to 100 feet long. And they really produce when the days get short and the nights get long. So they really are one of the rare fall producing crops. But they've been a staple on the New Orleans tables since at least the 1800s, maybe slightly even before that. It is believed that they reached the New World or the Gulf Coast by a couple of means, maybe the French, the English, and the Spanish. There's been reports that they came along with the Canary Islanders in the early days. But when Dr. Hill put together a very extensive history on the Mirliton, he noted that the term Mirliton is really, it's a French word, but it's really used to describe this fruit in only 2 locations, New Orleans and Haiti. And so if you look back, it's also a staple in the Haitian diet. So the Haitian Revolution, which I think was roughly from 1795 to about 1815, somewhere along those lines, had a huge influx of individuals coming to the New World, and primarily New Orleans. I think it vastly impacted the population there, so much so that we believe that with that came the culture and the desire to continue to take something from home that they were growing there. And we believe that that was the Mirliton. Now, if you go out into the grocery stores, you can find these chayote squash, and they say they're from Latin America or Puerto Rico or Mexico. But if you planted one in your yard, you'll find out that they do not do as well as the ones we have along the Gulf Coast. And that's because that we think the ones that we've been growing here have been on our soils for 200 plus years, and either they were better adapted to begin with, or they just better adapted over the centuries to our climates. So if you plant them, what you'll find is that those grow way up in the mountains and or along the coast, but they're also further down in the equator, so they don't start to flower until maybe November. Here, our varieties will start flowering about September 21st is what we traditionally said, although we're starting to see around the beginning of September. So what that means is that they'll take about 3 weeks to produce a fruit once pollinated. The vine has both male and female flowers on it. So what you'll find is that your vine will produce all summer long, make this beautiful, I call it Cajun kudzu vine. It's 50 to 100 feet long. And so what will happen there is that you can, you'll have this growth, a lot of beautiful shade, and then in the fall you'll get this bonus of these beautiful little flowers, first male and then female, and the females always have like a little Mirliton with a flower on the end of it. They'll produce by mid-October to mid-November. You start getting the Mirliton harvest, and they come in droves. A new plant probably will only produce about 30, but an older established plant, because these are perennials, they can produce anywhere up towards over 100, and in some cases, under right conditions, we've read over 350. So it's pretty prolific. And so as a result of that, you'll find the stuffed Mirliton or Mirliton casserole on your Thanksgiving Day tables and Christmas tables in the New Orleans diet. What you'll also find is that occasionally you will see in the established plants a spring crop. And the spring crops are typically a lot less, usually about maybe 30 to 50. Well, this year is quite an exception. Of all the information we've gained on Mirliton, especially since Dr. Hill's been really studying it in the last 15 years or so, we typically would say you'd have a slight chance of getting a spring crop, and you might get about 30, and the flowers will peter out by May or June, and then you really won't get a crop until the fall. And then what you would do is after that fall crop, before the first freeze, you'd cut it back and protect it, say around late December, once most of the production has been gone. But we found this year is that some of the growers have actually been able to keep their vines protected over the winter, and they kept producing Mirliton. Additionally, those who have either had cut back, they found that this spring they were actually producing bukus of Mirliton. Some reported as much as 200 plus on their vines. So it's been really pretty incredible and breaking a lot of our facts that we understood so far, that Mirliton keep changing and evolving. I'm not quite sure if it has something to do with the weather patterns this year. Who knows? But we've been very blessed to have a lot of heirloom Mirlitons. There's not just one single variety, and in fact, even though they've been grown for over 200 years in the New World or along the Gulf Coast and New Orleans, what you'll find is that there's a lot of variety. Some are light green, like the one I grow. Some are white, like the Israel Thibodeau. Some will be from about 1/2 pound, and others will be up to over 1 pound. The heirloom varieties are very pear-shaped and have a lot of deep crevices in them. But yet we still can find some that have, or smooth, or even have real thorny little spikes on them. So it's a very diverse vegetable, and you can find one that's to your personality or for whatever you like. There are about 10 named varieties that have come about through Dr. Hill's research, mostly attributed to the original growers or the ones he came across that were growing them. They also happen to be the ones that maybe have been the ones we could go as far back to and give credit to growing them. There's about 10 of them, but right off the top of my head, we got Blackledge, Papa Sylvestre, Miss Clara, Bebe LeBlanc, Joseph Boudreaux and Boudreaux-Robert, which I'm growing, and Israel Thibodeau and the Bogalusa Whites. And if you go to the Mirliton.org page, mirliton.org, you'll see all examples of what these different varieties look like. We also have a Facebook page, mirliton.org on Facebook. So come join the group, come check out the different varieties and see if maybe there's one that you grew up on and that you remember in particular. And then also check out the one I'm about to tell you about. So back when I was starting my gardening here in my Mobile house back around 2000, I I started growing mostly just the vegetables you could find anywhere, big box stores, and those did fine for me. Also around that time, or a few years after that, I came across the Encyclopedia of Cajun and Creole Cuisine by Chef John Folse. And it was in that I started seeing references to things like Mirlitons and Creole tomatoes and couchaus or gugutzas and various regional vegetables that I couldn't find at my grocery stores here in Mobile. So I took it upon myself to say, you know what? My climate here is very similar to the climates in Baton Rouge and South Louisiana. If it grows there, there's no reason it can't grow here. So I started to seek out those different seeds, and much of what you see here in this series is attributed to that quest. But one in particular that was elusive for a while was the Mirliton. I started out by planting one that I got from one of the big box stores out of their vegetable section. Produced a beautiful vine, and I thought, man, I was in luck. Started seeing flowers around Thanksgiving. And even actually had Mirliton on Thanksgiving, but it was only about the size of a walnut. Well, the next morning I woke up and I went out, and there it was lying on the ground. I was devastated. The one and only hope I had was gone, and I noticed that there were teeth marks on it. Yes, the dreaded squirrel, the mortal enemy of the Mirliton, had attacked it. But the plant ended up actually not surviving the winter, even though I cut it back. And come to find out, part of the problem with my failure in this growth was due to the fact that I had the wrong varieties. Because it was also at this time that Dr. Hill started putting out a lot of his great information. And one of his early documents, which you can find at the mirliton.org website, talks about how you need to get an heirloom variety. And I thought, aha, that's my problem. Well, we knew that a family friend, my grandfather's, had been growing them for decades, at least probably since the 1960s. And this gentleman's name is Dan Boudreaux. And Dan and my grandfather, Lucian Robert, were friends from back in the 1930s. They both were in the 3 Cs, the Civilian Conservation Corps. That group was responsible for many of the state parks and sea throughout South Louisiana at this time. They also ended up both going into the Navy during World War II. I don't believe that they actually served together, but they were both in the Navy. But anyway, Dan was a lifelong friend of my grandfather's, and in fact he was also familiar with my other grandfather, Paul Hubbell, Sr. So Dan's paths crossed with both sides of my family on numerous occasions. And it was around that time that after my grandfather had passed away, Dan was still going strong, and my Uncle Gary was actually able to contact him and found out that he could get a couple of these Mirlitons from him. And so we ended up with 4 of these Mirliton sprouts. And they were kind of shriveled and all, so at the time when we got them, we said, well, let's go ahead and put them in some pots just to preserve them. Well, it turned out that 2 of the ones I took and 2 my dad kept. And 2 of them actually, the one I had, they rotted. I didn't know anything about it. I was probably overwatering it. The ones that my dad had, one of them rotted, but one survived. And we planted that in his yard in Fairhope. And that Christmas, or right before that Christmas, that December, I went over there because I knew that we needed to start harvesting. And he said, well, there's probably only about 10 out there. Well, I went over there, and by the time we started digging through the vine, which was growing on a couple of sawhorses, we ended up with 65. And all for that, ended up with 85 Mirliton. We had a 5-gallon bucket that was just overflowing, and I'll even show you a picture of what it looked like on our first harvest. Well, at that point we were hooked, and I took a couple, started them, and I have 2 vines that I started here in my house in Mobile, and actually one still survives today. It's about 12 or 13 years old. And when I ended up reaching out to Dr. Hill about it, come to find out that he says, well, you can name it. It doesn't look like any variety that we already have. So I talked to Mr. Boudreaux on several occasions, and he told me, well, he originally got his from up closer to the Burnside area of Louisiana on the East Bank, up the Mississippi, just south of Baton Rouge. And that's where his family was from. It was really near the Hubbell restaurant that is now closed, but it was a long-time favorite out there. So he told me that's where he got his originally from. And he brought it down to Metairie, and he grew it for a number of years, starting in the 1960s. Well, he also traded some and gave some to my great-uncle Lawrence Chicken Robert in Luling, who had a huge farm, and Uncle Chicken would grow these as well. Well, what would happen, Dan said, is that sometimes his plants would die, but he'd get them back from Uncle Chicken. And sometime Uncle Chicken's plants would die, and Dan would give him his. So between the going back and forth between the two, I figured, you know, both gentlemen deserved a little recognition for this, for keeping this variety alive. So in their honor, we named it Boudreaux-Robert. I'm proud to be able to carry these on today, and since I've been growing them, I've actually been able to get them out to several other families in the South Alabama and even back to South Louisiana to grow. Mr. Boudreaux passed away sadly in 2019 at the ripe old age of 97. And Uncle Chicken died just before my grandfather did in 2007 at the ripe old age of 94. Is there something to be said about growing Mirliton and a long life, growing and eating Mirliton? I don't know, but I'm gonna give it a shot. So let's go check out how the one in my yard is doing and give you a better idea of what to expect if you try to grow these. Well, as you can see, the Mirliton vine is pretty expansive. This is primarily the oldest vine growing, but yet underneath it, I've got, as I said, 8 total. Here's another view of it. We find it best to put these on trellises or something that'll have room to let it grow. You can see it's already going on top of my citrus trees, which is fine because I'm not going to get any citrus this year. But it'll produce these little shoots and these little tendrils will come out and grab onto things. Now typically when if I'd be filming at this time of the year, you would not see the flowers because, as I said, the flowers really are a product of the fall when the days are short and the nights are long. But we actually have, because of whatever reason, a few examples out here to show. So here we have a cluster of male flowers, and once again you see the male flowers are just simply, I think it's the yellow pistils in there with the white petals. There's no fruit or many fruit around, but that gives you an idea what they look like. Now despite having these on there, I could see a female coming soon, but I really don't expect that due to the heat that's coming up now that we're up into the 80s and 90s. Now this is a rarity at this time of year, but yes, this is a Mirliton in the springtime. Now this is not really as big as they get, but this is a good example of what the general shape is of my Boudreaux-Robert Mirliton is. They're kind of pear-shaped, as you can see. They have a little bit larger base. They have these deep furrows, and they're this beautiful light green. Sometimes you'll get little spikes on the bottom, and I've got tons of pictures and tons of videos on my YouTube page to give you an example of what these look like, and you'll see those as part of this presentation. One of the other nice things about the Mirlitons is that, especially if you trellis it, it gives you a nice little shady area, a little place to get out of the sun. In fact, in some of the old newspapers, what I found is that they would be gentlemen, like in the Irish Channel, who had actually made basically a nice trellis that his family could kind of utilize and as a way, especially when you didn't have air conditioning, to break up the summer heat. Of course, the downside is that in the South we have mosquitoes. Of course, if you have mosquito issues, then that doesn't make it quite as pleasant. But to that extent, I decided I'd go ahead and put myself a nice little bench here, contemplate the wonders of the Boudreaux-Robert Mirlitons. As I said, I've got 8 plants here. Another view of the fruit. Well, so typically I only get a small spring crop of maybe anywhere from 2 to 6, and so usually I'll just eat those instead of trying to save them. Usually when you only have one, it's hard to do something with it other than maybe freeze it and blanch it and freeze it for a future cooking, or maybe just chop it up and stir fry it with some in a pan and serve it with some butter, or maybe part of a fajita vegetable mix. But anyway, you can see mine's doing pretty well. You can tell we had a lot of rain here the other night, but despite that, things are going well, and if the temperatures do operate, we'll end up with another stunning year. Last 3 years I've gotten over 100 off of the main vine, and so now that I've got 8 plants, no telling what I'm going to get this year. So hopefully I'll have plenty to be available to offer for folks in the Mobile area for those who are interested in growing this heirloom variety. Now, if you've never eaten them before, they're very popular in casseroles. They are very versatile. They have like what is described as a crystalline, very slightly sweet flavor to them. They're somewhat firm like a pear and a cucumber, but not as soft as your other typical squashes. They are perfect. Like I said, you get about 2 or 3 months worth of growth or production in the fall, and typically on your Thanksgiving tables you'll find things like stuffed Mirliton with shrimp and crab meat. Other people prefer to do it with ham, boudin, or even ground beef in general, but they are very versatile. We've made pickles with them, which are very good. You can make Mirliton bread, Mirliton pies, Mirliton au gratin. If you check out my channel, you'll see I've got at least a handful of Mirliton recipe videos as well. Oh, my favorite's got to be John Folse's Mirliton soup. I definitely have a video on that, so please check that one out as well. Anyway, if you have any questions, please send them to me at rpcajun2r@gmail.com or leave them in the comments section below. So if this information has been helpful or interesting to you, please give it a like and share it with your Mirliton loving friends. And if you haven't done so, please do me a favor and subscribe to the David J. Hubbell YouTube page, as well as click the alerts. That'll let me know people are interested in the subjects I'm talking about, and I'll keep finding more and more. I got at least another handful of different Louisiana varieties I'm growing in my backyard, so I got plenty to come. So once again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next week.